Beatriz, you're muted.
Thank you. Gracias. Sander, it's truly an honor to have you here. Welcome to Ethos Talks. This is the this first conversation is hosted with the Faculty of Psychology, which is our academic ally. And this is the first of what we hope will be many of these conversations, and we couldn't think of a better guest for it. Thank you for being part of this. We are very excited about this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
So great, let's get right into it. So Sander, thanks again for joining us today. Very, very excited to have you here. So there's a lot of interest in Colombia about the topic of misinformation generally, but today we have around 200 people, a couple of those in here in Zoom, and other people join us through our YouTube channel, the University YouTube channel. So it's a real mix of people we have here. We have practitioners working on misinformation, but also researchers in psychology, philosophy, and general public in general. So just to give you a general idea of who is here, I think we're all aware that misinformation is not just something that happens once in a while. It's a permanent feature of our societies these days. You will hear from us later that we're in an election campaign, and misinformation is ripe right now. Because of that, and because of this situation right now and the diversity of people, we're going to structure the conversation more or less this way. We're going to start with very foundational issues, with basic concepts that we'd like you to please share with us, to move to more cutting-edge questions, so to speak. So, and always keeping in mind that a lot of the public are very, very curious about the practical implications of your work. So with that in mind, let's just kick it off with a basic question that we know you present this information in your books and paper presentations. How do we find misinformation? How do you differentiate it from disinformation, malinformation, and its cousins?
Yeah. I mean, I think I generally appreciate this term of information disorders, that there's lots of kinds of problematic information, misinformation, of course, being one of those. I mean, we define misinformation as information that's either false or misleading. And I think the misleading part is a crucial element of it, because if you look at the total amount of misinformation in the media ecosystem, then the stuff that's 100% false is not that common. I mean, it's there, but it's not as common as actually misleading content. So information that maybe leverages a grain of truth, but otherwise is polarizing, biased, hyperpartisan, conspiratorial, emotionally manipulative. So misleading content, and you see that on topics like elections or vaccination. There is a huge amount of this more subtly manipulative content. And we know from research that actually impacts people psychologically much more than the earth is flat type of conspiracy theories. And so if you include that as part of the definition, then misinformation is a bigger problem. But of course, misinformation can be produced by error. It could be a mistake. Everyone sometimes makes errors, and that can be misinformation, right? Whereas disinformation is misinformation coupled with some psychological intention to actually deceive or harm other people. And so that's really the key difference between dis and misinformation, obviously, is the involvement of intent. But intent is really difficult to prove in a legal sense sometimes. I mean, it takes time. It's been done, for example, the tobacco industry. In the US, the courts have ruled that they intentionally misled the public about the harms of smoking. Same with the fossil fuel industry and climate change. So there are examples, but it takes a while, right? So in terms of real time, we often use the term misinformation unless we have evidence that it was intentional, in which case it would be disinformation. And then there's there's some gray area, and the definitions are not perfect. So sometimes people say information disorders or malinformation or infodemic, which I think kind of captures the larger problem. But I think it's good to be specific about whether there's intent or not, and whether we include misleadingness as part of the definition. And I should say that our definitions, last thing I'll say, they're not tied to a particular source. And I think sometimes this gets people really, aggravated, is that, misinformation can come from any source. Some sources produce it more than others, but I think it's important to tie the misinformation, to define it independent of source, because a hard lesson the United States had to learn was that, the government is typically not considered a source of misinformation. Public health authorities in the US, for example, are a source of accurate information. But at the moment, all of my colleagues in public health, for example, they're telling people not to get information from the CDC or the Centers for Disease Control or the official government website, because now they're in a situation where the government is actually publishing inaccurate information. And so, what was once a source of accurate information can quickly become a source of inaccurate information. And of course, people in certain audiences in certain countries are much more used to that than others. But that's why I think it's important to keep it separate from source-based definitions.
Thank you, Sander. So your work is based on an idea that might sound counterintuitive for some, which is that misinformation or disinformation. I'm trying to think which one should I focus, but isn't that people are poorly educated, or isn't a fact of lack of information, but rather that we are all vulnerable because of how our minds work. So can you help us understand this and why this is so important? Is this a so important premise?
Yeah, so I think the premise is, I mean, it's true that some people might fall for misinformation because they don't have knowledge in the area, right? And they might be more vulnerable, or sometimes some people are less analytical and might be duped by numerical tricks, for example. But on the whole, we all share the same brain, and disinformation producers exploit vulnerabilities that are common to most people's brains. And so some of that includes this phenomenon of illusory truth. So illusory truth is the idea that the more that you repeat misinformation, the more people are likely to think that it's true. And that's because the brain mistakes fluency for truth. So something becomes fluent when you can process it without thinking, so sort of automatically, right? And the more you repeat information in general, the faster, in terms of bits of information, the faster the brain can actually process it. But then it assumes that fluency is a signal for truth. So we know 2 times 2 is 4 because we've heard it before, and we know that that's true. But unfortunately, the same is true for misinformation. And so disinformation, misinformation producers. And well, I guess we haven't covered propaganda, which is kind of disinformation in the service of a political agenda. But all of those actors, they leverage that phenomenon, so they keep repeating the lies. So the more they repeat the lies, the more normalized it becomes, the more familiar it feels, the more easy it is for the brain to process it, and the more likely the people are to think it's true. Now, it's not the case that people all of a sudden wake up and now think that some conspiracy is true, but they find it more plausible than before because they keep hearing it. It also normalizes it in a moral sense, that people feel, and some studies have shown this, people feel it's less immoral to share misinformation the more often you hear it. So the first time you hear it, say, oh, it sounds crazy, I'm not going to share that. But the more you keep hearing it, oh, maybe there's something to it, I'm going to share that with my audience. And so these are all mechanisms that people can leverage in terms of getting people to spread misinformation. Others relate to cognitive biases that we have, like confirmation bias, right? So we're all quicker to confirm evidence that fits with our pre-existing views of the world than with evidence that contradicts it. And again, you can measure how fast people are to agree, and share information that fits with their belief system versus information that doesn't fit with our belief systems. So a lot of misinformation is intentionally framed in a way that coheres with particular worldviews that people might have. Some misinformation exploits emotions. Again, we all have emotions. We all share emotions. It's not that difficult to get people riled up by making emotionally exaggerated claims, by trying to instill fear, anger. We all have those emotions, and they can be exploited. So we all have these elements in common that I think makes everyone vulnerable to mis and disinformation, even though there are profiles of people who might be more vulnerable, right? So if you look at individual differences, People are high in paranoia, low in trust, get most of their information from social media, very cognitively rigid, so black and white thinking. So there's a profile of people who are more vulnerable to extremism. But in general, we're all susceptible because we share the same, cognitive and emotional architecture.
So yeah, we have found some evidence validating what you've just said in our research in Deep in Colombia. For people being more educated are not less vulnerable, but also people that have high dehumanization, distrust, perceived discrimination, and intolerance to ambiguity. They rank
Exactly.
higher in falling for disinformation. So. And I think one of the things you've been I don't know if it's outspoken or insistent, is that maybe fact checking, because of what you've just said, is not the best way to reduce vulnerability, because you can repeat this information. And people that have a high tendency to maybe a political ideology that coincides with what's being said can fall for it and not correct it, right? So your research has shown that psychological inoculation is a more effective antidote. And this is the idea that we can essentially vaccinate people against misinformation before they're exposed. I think this is a really, really important finding for Colombia, because we tend to focus a lot of our resources in correcting information. So how does this work in practice? Can you share some of the recent examples of interventions? How is this different from fact-checking or traditional media literacy strategies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have been outspoken about it, but I guess I should clarify that look, I think fact checking and debunking is important. I mean, we just need to do it because we're not going to be able to pre-bunk everything and everyone everywhere. But I think it's hard to disagree with the idea that prevention is better than cure, right? And especially in psychological terms. So we know that once people are exposed to misinformation, it integrates into our mental models of how the world works, right? So your memory is like a social network. There's nodes and concepts and links between the concepts. And when you try to debunk or fact check, often after people have been exposed, you're in a strategically disadvantageous position that you now have to repeat the misinformation and say somebody said something that's false. And then what happens is that now you have to either just say it's false or you have to say what's true instead. And what happens in practice is that people tend to repeat the misinformation, which actually strengthens the links that people already had with the misinformation. And now the success of the intervention is going to depend on whether people can suppress the misinformation and access corrective information. And that only works if the accurate information is presented in a much stronger way than the misinformation, if it resonates with people more than the misinformation. Corrections tend to be long, boring, scientific. They don't get as much traction as misinformation, right? So there's all of these reasons of why debunking or fact-checking I'm not so worried about it going wrong and this sort of backfire that people become more convinced of the misinformation. I think that's pretty rare. But there is this what we call continued influence of misinformation. So misinformation continues to influence our reasoning even when we have acknowledged a fact check, right? So the best you can hope for is that fact checking and debunking reduces reliance on misinformation if you do it in the most evidence-based way possible, right? You minimize repetition of misinformation, you make the correction prominent, interesting for people, and you actually get traction in spreading the correction. So under all of those ideal conditions, the best we can hope for, I think, is that you reduce reliance. So for all of these reasons, we thought prevention is better than cure. So let's try to prevent people from encoding misinformation into their brains in the first place through this idea of pre-bunking or inoculation. And how it's different from fact-checking is whereas with fact-checking, you repeat the misinformation and give people facts. With the inoculation, you actually administer a weakened dose of the misinformation, a neutralized version. So you don't repeat the misinformation. You synthesize like a vaccine. You synthesize a weakened strain of the misinformation, and then you strongly refute that in advance so people can build up cognitive resistance, like the body builds up immunity, right? By being exposed to a weakened version of a pathogen, the immune system starts to generate immunity. And the same can be done with the mind by preemptively training people using weakened dose simulations to try to get our quote unquote, cognitive antibodies in motion. And people do that because nobody wants to be manipulated. So you have to trigger people's what we call deception monitoring, so people become more alert to potential attempts to manipulate them. This is the forewarning aspect of deinoculation. So you have to forewarn people that others might try to manipulate them. And then you administer the weakened dose or the pre-bunk. Yeah, to give you a practical example of how to do that, so there's many ways of doing it. So it could be issue based around a singular particular types of issue, or it could be technique based, which are about the general techniques of manipulation. So concretely, let's take polarization, right? Creating an us versus them mentality. So we use the weakened dose with this sort of polarization technique. We did one study in the US, and this is very US focused, but we take a funny example, like should you put pineapple on pizza, right? And so then we say, oh, the Italians, they're going to be offended because cultural appropriation. This is horrible, putting pineapple on pizza, absolute disaster. And then the Americans say, but freedom. In this country you can do anything, and so don't restrict my freedom. This is an attempt to limit me politically. And then we reverse it on people, and then we sort of we do games and videos, but the basic idea is that we illustrate polarization using a weakened sort of version of it that's kind of funny and harmless. But that actually gets the point across. We have another one. You mentioned dehumanization, so we have one on scapegoating where again, this is US based. There's a show called South Park, which is a weird comedy cartoon in the US, and they always blame all the bad things in society on Canada, which is funny to Americans. So we use that example from South Park, the sort of clip, to show that you can always blame Canada no matter what the issue is. And then we test people with real examples, though, with like real polarizing examples. And we find people can see the template, right? Us versus them. They can now recognize it and then become more resistant, more skeptical. They're less willing to trust it. But that's at the technique level. You can be very specific too. So Twitter, before Elon Musk, adopted some of these approaches, and they tried to pre-bunk election disinformation. The typical playbook is, so for inoculation to be effective, you generally need to figure out what the playbook is. So we did that in some studies in the context of US elections. But on Twitter, they figured out one of the most common things is to confuse people about when to vote, where to vote, and how to vote. Those are the types of things that actors will try to sow confusion about. So they tried to pre-bunk that by actually telling people in advance, you might see misinformation on the platform, you should be warned. People will try to confuse you about where to vote, when to vote, how to vote. Here is how they might do that with a weakened dose sort of example, and then authoritative information that arms people to resist it if somebody tries to persuade them otherwise. For example, voting happens during these hours at these locations, and you can do it by mail or online. If somebody tries to convince you that it's not safe, by mail, this is a common technique. Here's what you should know. That's a very kind of fact-based, specific type of pre-bunk. So you can go very narrow or you can go very broad at the technique level, but both are preemptive and break it down without repeating misinformation, but you're using a weakened version to get the point across. And the last thing I'll say on it is, at a state level, this was used to disrupt the invasion of Ukraine, where US and the UK intelligence preemptively released information that Putin was planning to invade Ukraine. And the way they did that was to forewarn people that they were going to see fake propaganda videos. and that, they would see Ukrainian soldiers on Russian soil, but people should know these are like crisis actors. This is totally fake. Here's how they fake it. And that was preemptively released to the NATO community. And then Putin had to, he still invaded Ukraine because, he was going to do that anyway, but he had to find a new pretext, right? So there was a strategic couple of days that allowed the international community to coordinate by pre-bunking the attempt. Zelensky pre-bunked Putin's deepfake that they had intelligence that Putin was going to put out a video that Zelensky has surrendered. And so Zelensky preempted that by putting out a pre-bunk and saying, Putin's going to tell you that we've surrendered using a deepfake. However, that isn't me. Here's what I'm saying, and so on. Taiwan, the digital minister in Taiwan deepfake themselves every year up to the election in anticipation of Chinese deepfakes. And so they took this novel approach, and the digital minister was a computer scientist by training, Audrey Tang. And she was able to create deepfakes of herself in a funny way to teach the population how a minister could be deepfaked, right? And then, but not just before the election. She did it 3 years in advance of the election. Again, 2 years. Again, 1 year. So by the time the Chinese deepfakes came, the population was more resilient to identify it. So yeah, those are all kind of practical ways that you could pre-bunk or inoculate.
No, amazing. And I think you mentioned a few examples, really interesting for us now, because we are a few weeks for some elections. William.
Thank you. I was going to continue this on the pre-bunking examples. There's one of a recent work you did on Instagram. There was this large experiment. I'd like you to talk about that, but I have a question about that specifically, because coming back to an earlier issue you mentioned, is some of the vulnerability factors that play into our susceptibility to misinformation. And in this work, one of the things that you guys identified as driving the possible misinformation was the appeal to emotion fallacy. And earlier you told us about how, and we know, I think, that misinformation normally have negative emotional content, and you work with that. So my questions continue with these examples on pre-bunking is one, very practical, trying to give practical advice to our listeners and how to design these pre-bunking exercises that tap into emotion. And the other one is more about how do you actually do a pre-bunking exercise in Instagram? Like it's I think it's fascinating, along with the example you mentioned.
So I guess what I had mentioned before was that initially we started doing this by building interactive games that simulate a social media feed for voters or citizens. And then, because games are so flexible and adaptive, we can always change them and update them. And it's fun for people so they don't feel like they're being lectured to. And we're able to reach, millions of people with that. But at the end of the day, that people have to be open-minded and come to the game, right? And so social media companies told us at this time, like, yeah, we want to help implement this. Another way to do it is through videos. They said you could create, a 30-second video for, or 60-second video for social media. Those annoying ads on YouTube that you can't skip. So they said, we could put pre-bunking ads there. So before people expose to misinformation, we put a pre-bunk and then make it non-skippable so that billions of people see it all at once. And we thought, whoa, that's a great way to accelerate this research. And, we did the research with them. We had success. I mean, the effects are modest, right? We're talking about psychological interventions, right? So we're talking about modest effects. But if you scale that across billions of people, that could be potentially meaningful. Now they validated it. It worked. They did it on their own. And of course, once it became clear that these social media companies no longer had to do anything about misinformation because of the change in policy in the United States, they decided to abandon this whole project and not do anything about no fact checking, no pre-bunking, no debunking. And so we thought, okay, so we initially developed this in cooperation with social media companies because they allowed us to use the YouTube system to do this. Because on YouTube, there's ads and you can ask questions. Those corporations use it, right, to ask people questions and stuff. So we thought, how could we do this without the corporation of social media companies. And that's how we came to Instagram. And so we looked at Instagram, and Instagram had developed this new poll sticker functionality. So if you're an NGO or a campaign, a social media, if you run social media campaigns, anyone can do this now. So all you need is to basically hijack the quiz functionality, whether it's YouTube or Instagram, and run a campaign. Now, the problem is historically, you can't randomize people to a treatment or control group. We were able to do this on YouTube because we had YouTube's help, right? So there was a control group and a treatment group, one who sees the ad, one who doesn't see the ad, and it's randomized. On Instagram, it turns out people often declare their birth month, right? So the year that they're born in, that's a profile element. In the ad manager, very practically, in the Instagram ad manager, you can actually create pseudo kind of randomized control groups. So you could randomize people to the campaign based on their birth month. So for example, we'll say that, we'll randomly select a number of months. Those will go control. The other months will go treatment. That's pseudo random in the sense that we assume that there's no differences in people's, if you were born in June, your ability is no different from someone who's born in November, for example. That's, assuming that's a reasonable assumption. Then you have two groups, right, randomized by birth month, who are exposed to either your campaign, you create an ad, a pre-bunking ad, or nothing. And then you can poll those groups. So you can, in the Instagram ad manager, you can tell them to answer a question, days later, a week later, months later. And that's how we tested people. So then we confronted them with a quiz with an example, and I asked people, is this true or false, or what technique is this? You can be creative in how you ask it. And then you actually get results from both the treatment and the control group. From real Instagram users, we targeted young people on Instagram with a fake emotional manipulation campaign. You mentioned that, I created a fake story about how yoga causes cancer. Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, I was wondering how terrifying is it that yoga, for people to think that yoga causes full body cancer? How do you guys check
that? Well, we weren't interested in whether people believe that claim, but whether they can recognize the emotional manipulation in it, right? So we asked people, we gave people a headline like that, and then we asked them, which technique is this? Emotional manipulation or false dilemma, for example. So that's kind of the way that we check. And so people are really bad at this. So on Instagram, in the control group, only, 39% of people correctly identified emotional manipulation in a headline in the control group. But in the treatment group, we almost got it up to 60%. So you might think, oh, it's obvious emotional manipulation, but actually young people on Instagram, they're not really understanding emotional manipulation in news headlines. You can make it more difficult. You could give people a claim and ask, is this true or false, if you want to get into the veracity of a specific claim, right? So we were interested in the technique. Can people understand the technique? Because that tends to be less polarizing, right? If you can identify emotional manipulation. You can still believe that yoga causes full body cancer, but at least it's emotional manipulation, right? And we hope that when people recognize it, they will also believe it less, which is what we find in the lab. But that's hard, if you want to verify that in a campaign, you can change the question, do you believe this? Yes or no? So that's how and then you can follow up with people over time. You can also look at behavior. So we include links where people can click to learn more, and we can see, do people who've been inoculated click to learn more than control? And that's what we found. They were 3 times more likely to click to actually learn more about this stuff. And so, yeah, but the opt-in rate is really low. So you have to target hundreds of thousands of people to get a few hundred responses in these groups. So because most people on Instagram just don't participate in polls and surveys. So that's the downside. When you work with a social media company, they can force it, and they can get much bigger reach. But if you're doing this on your own, you have to rely on opt-in rates, which you can crank up by making content really engaging and short and bottom line, and so you can get higher engagement rates, so you get more people participating. Sorry, you were about to ask something.
No. Just I was trying to think how the pre-banking could be considered as a way of, I don't know, capacity building. Like you're helping people develop the capacities they need to recognize and handle misinformation. There's a question from the public about how we promote a more responsible consumption of social media, and this brings to mind something I correct if I'm wrong. I find in all this literature about how older people tend to share more fake content, but they're less susceptible to it, and then how it is. Their susceptibility might not be due to age, but to partisan bias. So I was wondering,
Yeah.
for how pre-banking works for older people. How would it work, and what capacity would be tapping into when we work with our older people? I mean, this is a personal concern of my own. I see my parents now glued to TikTok lately. I find very surprising.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we have a test, a misinformation susceptibility test, for example, and then we find that young people are more susceptible, but older people share more political fake news because of partisan biases, right? So there's this kind of U curve almost that both young and older audiences are problematic for different reasons. Yeah, obviously it's better to pre-bunk with youth when they're still developing and haven't been exposed so much, right, and don't have a crystallized view of the world. But most of the pre-bunking campaigns we run with adults, and generally, of course, you find that the more the more settled people are in their views, right, the harder it is to get traction. But you can still get so a lot of the pre-bunking we do at the technique level. I would say age has not been a important factor in this. So you can recognize emotional manipulation if you're 50 or if you're 20, right? That doesn't matter so much. But I think what does matter is how influential that is on subsequent belief formation. So if you can now identify emotional manipulation and you're young and still forming your belief, that might actually lead you to adopt more accurate beliefs. But if you're 50 and very settled in your political beliefs, you can now, better spot emotional manipulation, but maybe it's less likely to change your underlying beliefs because they're more settled, right? And that's kind of the tension between the different kinds of pre-bunking. So you can do very specific pre-bunking that's less about capacity building and more about changing so for example, in climate, we've done very specific campaigns where we inoculate against sowing doubt about expert consensus, for example. And there you find that, yeah, with older audiences, you can protect them from misinformation about the scientific consensus on climate change, but it's not going to change their underlying views about climate. So it's still useful in the sense that they're not consuming additional misinformation, but you're not going to overhaul their belief system, right? And maybe that isn't always the goal of pre-bunking anyway. But that is kind of the important consideration that if you're interested in changing particular beliefs, it's better to do the specific type of pre-bunking inoculation, whereas the technique one is better for capacity building at a more general level, with some uncertain translation into specific sort of beliefs. I mean, we do find that most people who recognize emotional manipulation or polarization or conspiratorial thinking also find it less trustworthy. But you still don't know for sure, of course, how that affects their voting intentions, for example. And maybe the last thing that's useful for this audience is cultural adaptation. So we've done these trials in India, for example, as well as Brazil, which is an interesting context because Brazil, as you know, the Supreme Court and regulations very strong in Brazil at the moment. But what we found was actually that the global South, global North was less relevant than urban rural. So we did some trials on using simulated WhatsApp engines because WhatsApp is so prevalently used in Brazil and in other countries in the global South that instead of what we do here with X or Facebook, we use WhatsApp instead. But this intervention did not work in rural areas in Brazil or rural areas in India. But we did have success in big metropolitan cities in both Brazil and in India. And so if you look at the responses, people in major urban centers in Brazil are responding in a very similar way to people in London, whereas people in rural areas are just completely different, right? Initially, we had a lot of obstacles like the humor, the metacognition of the sarcasm, and the simulating social media. There's potential for confusion that you have to eliminate. You have to make it simpler. There's lower literacy levels, right? And so it had to be much more straightforward, less multidimensional in terms of the jokes. Social media is used in a different way. So we had to fundamentally change the interventions as well as the testing. I mean, people in rural areas, they're not used to a hypothetical question about social media. I mean, they were just getting confused about the way we test. They're like, why are you asking me this question in a hypothetical sense, right? Like, and so adaptation is key. We ran a campaign in Poland once with a duck for Facebook. Turns out the duck, quacks like a duck sort of thing. Turns out the duck is a polarized animal in Poland, and so people did not like that. So what we've learned is cultural adaptation is key. There's an organization, an NGO in the US, who adapted our interventions for the Latin American audience within the United States. They did a great campaign and developed great material for the Spanish-speaking population in the US, and they had a lot of success with that. But it required careful adaptation using culturally relevant examples, understanding how people locally use social media. So yeah, I think we've scaled it as far as we could in urban centers that are all kind of similar. But I think when you go into different areas, the cultural adaptation aspect is really important.
Sander, so in our deep research in Colombia, we found, talking about age, we found that age didn't affect people's ability to identify this information in our research. This was 3 or 4 years ago. But younger people were more vulnerable to left-leaning content, while older people fell for right-leaning content. And also we found that these 4 factors I mentioned you before: distrust, dehumanization, perceived discrimination, and high need for cognitive closure, were like the main drivers that were making people fall for disinformation. So we designed a video. It's not a design video, it's a social experiment alive in which we try to tackle these factors, like people reflecting on how absurd were they believed maybe that people that were thinking different from them were less human. So, but these weren't like jokes, or this was not a pre-bunking experiment in the sense it was like out there. It's like it was a joke, or it was a diminished version of the problem, right? And it was really effective. We found in this one experiment, we reduced vulnerability to misinformation in 30%. We haven't been able to validate it again, but my question is like 2 questions. What does science tell us about why these specific factors that are more partisan identity driver factors open the door to believing false content? And you mentioned some examples before, but how do you design pre-bunking strategies to tackle those factors? Not just to teach people how to recognize manipulation techniques, but to reflect on their own biases, and how do they become more aware of how are they driving them to being more vulnerable to misinformation? I'm not sure. Yeah? So why?
Yeah, well, I think, there was just a study out that shows that when you assign children, 4 or 5-year-olds, to fictional groups and you ask them to process evidence, they find evidence that aligns with the other group less accurate than the evidence that aligns with their own group. So I think from a very early age, developmentally, we learn to assimilate information in a way that aligns with the groups that we belong to, whether that's a social group or a political group. So I think, it's quite well established that people process information in a way that aligns with the groups that they belong to. We did a big computational study of social media. One of the things we found is what predicts virality and engagement is content that, derogates the other group, that dehumanizes the other group, as you said. I think that's the type of content that creates traction. What's difficult though is it's one thing to pre-bunk it, but getting people to pay attention to their own biases is much more difficult. So one of the things we find in our pre-bunking work is that the polarization one people struggle with. So we do polarization by actually telling people, look, doesn't matter what side you're on. Anyone can use us versus them. And we let people play around in a simulator by, understanding how bad actors might try to sow the vision. But still, people find it hard to reflect on their own biases, right? They tend to think the other side's using it. And so one of the things we've tried to do is combine inoculation with some other types of interventions. One of the things we've had some success with is actively open-minded thinking, which is most closely related to understanding and overcoming your own biases. So people who are high in actively open-minded thinking tend to be more okay with uncertainty, have more tolerance for ambiguity, tend to reflect on how information affects different groups, are more flexible in their thinking. But it's very hard to train actively open-minded thinking. And so what we actually tried to do is that we try to explain to people in the pre-bunk that some of the misinformation actually is an attack on actively open-minded thinking. It's trying to shut down your thinking by getting you to think in black and white terms. So this group is bad, this group is good. And actually, you want to maintain your actively open-minded thinking because that's, good for, not in those words like epistemic, diversity. We didn't use those types of words, but the idea was to actually cultivate actively open-minded thinking. And we found that it did indirectly reduce endorsement of partisan types of misinformation. So I think if you can combine the pre-bunk with a way to get people a positive way to get people to reflect on their own biases, I think we found that to be helpful. Sometimes there's synergies in different types of interventions. So this actively open-minded induction worked well when you pair it with a pre-bunk. So yeah, that's some of the things that we've been trying to do. But I agree, it's generally hard to get people to reflect on their own biases, and pre-bunking encounters more resistance. So in other experiments, what we do is we present people with sources for the misinformation, in-group source or an out-group news source, right? If you're left, right. And we also manipulate the amount of likes the misinformation has. And so when you're inoculated, okay, it works well, you're inoculated. But now, if the misinformation is politically is aligned with the source that you like, the inoculation struggles more in the sense that it still works, but the effect is reduced because people are seduced by the source, or they're seduced by the huge amount of likes, right? So there are things that interfere with the inoculation process because we all have biases that disinformation producers are trying to appeal to. So that's why, yeah, trying to enhance the inoculation is something that we've been trying to do now. Another way to enhance it is through using influencers. So we've done campaigns with the UN, WHO, it works well, but some people just don't trust those organizations. So if you use local community leaders, religious leaders, local comedians, we've tried. We use humor, but it's not important to use humor. It can be serious, you can do anything, but we just like the humorous approach. But because comedy lowers people's defenses, right, in political sort of debate. So we've used national sort of comedians in videos, and we found that if you use influencers to disseminate the pre-bunk, that can be another way to increase uptake, really, of it. So vaccines have adjuvants, like a substance to make it bind to the body, right? So that it produces a better resistance to antigens. And the pre-bunks, they need some kind of stickiness too in order to improve uptake.
Yeah, great. We found
have
recently that
3 minutes left.
3 minutes. Yeah. Go ahead. I just was going to comment.
So sorry, just to wrap it up, I think that what Sandra was saying speaks directly to a question from public by Camilo about the limits to the the kind of pre-banking interventions. Let's just maybe just have time for one last question. I want to go off script here and change tack to policy level. Today, my feed shows up on one of a paper published today by you, Sander, on Nature Health, and how social media bans for teens lack evidence. And more generally about how governments can actually prevent misinformation. We know there's like AL labels and now bans in schools. In these last 3 minutes, I don't know if you can talk to us about why you think there's not enough evidence for social media bans and how this is affecting our capacity of young people to detect misinformation.
Well, I think, bans are being considered everywhere now, and I think it's good that there's political momentum. It's just that there's just we don't have any evidence whether they work or not. And the evidence we do have from schools in the UK shows that they had no effect. But that could be because the study wasn't good, because we don't have that many good studies. For example, in Australia, the ban's in effect, and we should see what happens. But my larger concern is that there are real harms of social media and misinformation. And social media algorithms exploit vulnerabilities in young people, lower self-control, more risk-seeking, reward circuitry, social comparison stuff. I'm just not sure if we need to shift the blame on kids and restrict their autonomy. I think we should put the blame on the companies and force them to create age-appropriate feeds that do not maximize for engagement, that are just fundamentally different. Because, social media also has benefits to kids. For, LGBTQ community, they can find support for certain types of minorities, right? They get mental health support online. There's social connection. They coordinate social activities. So we want to preserve the benefits of social media and cut out all of the harms. And the blame should be put on social media companies to fix their faulty products. And regulators can do that, for example, through court actions or through independent regulators. And then if they don't comply, then we can consider the ban, right? If they don't comply with safety and transparency, then we can consider the ban. But we want to preserve some of the benefits for kids, I think. And the other thing is that bans don't give any skills. They don't empower youth, right? Technology is not going to go away. The future is going to be all technology, all sorts of chat bots, LLMs, integrating psychology with technology. It doesn't seem feasible. I think we need to prepare the future generations how to use technology responsibly, how to use it safely, give them the skills. Start in schools from as young as the age of 4, controlled, gradual education. How to use an iPad for family photos, maybe the next year for drawing and education, all the way up to eventually digital media. And I think that will empower youth to use it safely, responsibly, right? You can't drive a car without a license. Maybe we should do the same with social media. But of course, that only works if the feeds are safe. So I think we need a dual approach, right? Pressure the social media companies with regulation and invest heavily in digital technology education. I think bans are just not nuanced, and it's sort of short-term way to stop the problem. Let's just ban it all. But that doesn't make the problem go away in the future. I think it will just come back to haunt us. That's my concern.
Right. Thank you very much. I know our time is
We
up.
know, yeah, you have to go. You have an important meeting in 5 minutes. So,
Thanks very much.
Sander, thank you. Thank you for your time, for your research, your generosity. We've learned a lot. We're definitely going to search lots of things you mentioned here. And we hope this is just the beginning of more interesting conversations. Thank you a lot.
Likewise, my pleasure. If anyone wants any questions or resources, happy to help.
Thank you.
Thank you very
All
much.
right.
We'll
Thanks
surely
very
be in
much.
touch.
Great conversation. Thank you.
Great.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bueno,
Nos
muchas gracias a las personas que nos unen en este momento. Nosotros vamos a quedar unos minutos más. Profesor Sander tenía que salir un poquito antes de la hora y por eso no tuvimos tiempo para las preguntas. Disculpas a Camilo y a Laura en el público que pusieron algunas preguntas que intentamos meter ahí. Pues vamos a quedar aquí charlando un rato. Si alguien tiene ganas de compartir algo.
compartir sí, otra pregunta que podamos conversar entre nosotros.
Se nos quedaron en el tintero varias preguntas, en
Sí,
particular las
no, pues.
relacionadas con política, que teníamos muchas ganas de
Pero
hacer,
él
¿no?
dio varios examples. El cerebro, en mi cerebro no es tan flexible, entonces. eh, pero él dio varios ejemplos que me parece que, o sea, esto es una conversación que definitivamente voy a volver a revisar. Dio
Ujú.
muchos ejemplos que veo muy
Sí,
relevantes para lo que está pasando en Colombia, para organizaciones que están trabajando, por ejemplo, en cómo hacer para que las personas no caigan en desinformación sobre el voto. Ahorita hay todo un tema alrededor de la desinformación que está circulando, de riesgos en las elecciones. Dio mucha información sobre, por ejemplo, el tema de la pizza me pareció maravilloso. Creo que nos aplica,
ujú.
podemos hacer
El-
cosas similares en
sí.
temas de polarización, las formas como dio, ideas de cómo se pueden hacer experimentos. Yo creo que en Colombia, lo que yo he visto, nosotros enfrentamos mucha dificultad en cómo hacer buenos RCTs y buenos experimentos y pruebas. Y en lo que él nos contó, o sea, se me disparó la cabeza de la cantidad de cosas que uno puede hacer tal vez de forma más costo efectiva. Em, entonces sí, se nos quedaron en el tintero unas preguntas, pero creo que también hubo muchas cosas que se respondieron en los ejemplos que él dio. Gracias a todas las personas que están acá. Si no lo pudieron ver o si quieren revivir esta conversación, va a quedar colgada en YouTube. Vamos a ponerle los subtítulos correspondientes. Em, y pues
Y por
esperamos
ahí
poder
preguntan
seguir
si está,
haciendo espacios como
ahorita,
este.
ahorita va a quedar colgada en una hora en el canal de Uniandes y luego creo que en el de Ethos,
En el de Deep, va a estar también en
en
el
el de
YouTube
ahí,
de Deep.
perdón.
Y pues síganos, síganos en las redes. Vamos a seguir generando conversaciones como esta. Esperamos muy próximamente en Ethos Talks. No sé, William, si quieres
Vamos,
cerrar
en
con
dos
algo
semanas
más.
nos vemos en persona a propósito,
Ah,
todos muy invitados, muy invitadas, el 12 de marzo en el Auditorio Lleras de la Universidad de los Andes. Vamos a tener una actividad de lujo para charlar sobre más en general el papel de las juventudes en la democracia, donde vamos a tocar esos temas también.
sí, 12 de marzo, de 2 a 5, a 6 de la
Correcto,
tarde,
sí.
en el Auditorio Alberto Lleras con Margo. Ya en nuestras redes van a empezar a salir tanto de la facultad como de Ethos, el link a las inscripciones para que se inscriban y vayan. Van a haber dos paneles súper interesantes con unos panelistas de lujo. Vamos a hacer una exposición de algunos resultados de sondeo a jóvenes. Vamos a lanzar una herramienta de salud mental para jóvenes. La facultad también nos va a contar un poco qué está haciendo. Ojalá puedan ir. Este es un tema muy importante para nuestro contexto actual.
Voy a pegarlo aquí. Ahí me
Eh,
dice Alejandro,
sí.
voy a compartir el link en
Ah,
el
de
chat solo para...
maravilla. Sí,
Sí.
en el chat. Inscríbanse de una vez.
Por ahí también David GB dice algo que en lo que yo creo. Hay tanta desinformación que en que medida que somos más conscientes de esto, parece que uno no prefiere creer en nada. Yo creo que es un riesgo real con las redes. Y por eso, en parte, estas conversaciones que queremos tener, pues no solamente desde la universidad, es abierto a todo el público, sí, eso no es un evento de universidad, eso no es un tema académico, sino es un tema que nos convoca a todos. Tanto lo que vamos a charlar en 2 semanas, como estos temas más específicos de desinformación.
Ay, fíjate que hay una cosa que me sorprendió, que la
Entonces
verdad no
ya lo estoy
sabía,
buscando.
y es el, pues, que va a ese mismo tema, y es, pues, las advertencias que ahora hay que hacer de que no se sigan organismos oficiales de temas de salud porque están em, comunicando desinformación. Pues eso es gravísimo, porque realmente se incrementa la situación de que no se saben qué y en quién creer. O sea, uno, pues, está muy difícil. A nosotros en estos días nos han estado enviando mensajes de odio, por ejemplo, personas me imagino yo, o bots o personas de derecha diciendo que sí estamos financiados por izquierda, y personas de izquierda que sí estamos financiados por derecha, otros que sí estamos financiados por gobierno, simplemente por difundir un sondeo, por ejemplo, nacional a jóvenes porque queremos, y pues ninguna de las anteriores. Pero el mensaje que uno saque y el interés es asumido con un lente dependiendo de quién lo ve. Y ahí pues son problemas y retos en los que vamos a seguir trabajando y en los que estamos comprometidos, y pues que hay que seguir innovando en soluciones y por eso este espacio.
Sí, y ahí pegué el link sobre el evento que tenemos con también el contexto de estas conversaciones que estamos teniendo para que lo vean. Hay una cosa adicional que quería mencionar que estamos haciendo también desde el Departamento de Psicología. Es unas jornadas de psicología sobre ciencias del comportamiento en la que estamos tocando temas en general sobre cambio de conducta alrededor de actividades socialmente relevantes. También para que las vean. Por ahí Laura pregunta, consumo de violencia, un buen referente sobre consumo de violencia en redes sociales. No se me ocurre. ¿A qué te refieres, Laura, con el consumo? ¿Cómo prevenir consumo de violencia? O tal vez Beatriz, ¿sabes?
No, la tendencia a consumir no he visto.
Ah,
Muy interesante pregunta. Em, pero pues pensaría que debe haber bastante investigación que explica por qué hay cierto
mm.
tipo de esas características y información negativa y que despierta nuestras emociones morales y ese tipo de cosas, nos llama más la atención.
Sí, pues,
Em,
a la literatura, de hecho, Sander tiene un trabajo sobre esto que es el uso de la indignación moral, del moral outrage, como mecanismo para motivar el consumo de contenido. Entonces, la palabra clave es como eso de moral outrage. Entonces, si yo veo un TikTok de un motociclista cruzándose el semáforo en rojo, eso es más adictivo que si veo al motociclista no pasándose el semáforo en rojo. Perdón a los motociclistas. Eh, y eso es una cosa que se está usando para crear contenido adictivo. Entonces, eso, moral outrage es como, en psicología al menos les podría decir que es un tema muy de moda como referente para explicar el clickbait de consumo de contenido violento, que está asociado con injusticias particulares. Y eso, por ejemplo, eso del linchamiento. Entonces, es aprovechar la necesidad de justicia que todos tenemos como para que consumamos más y más contenido. Bueno, Beatriz, ¿estás muteada? ¿Estás
sí,
hablando? Ah,
sí. Gracias por pues estar acá, que es un gusto tenerlos y pues nos vemos muy pronto, el 12 de
nos
marzo.
vemos el 12. Bueno, hasta luego.
Un
Gracias
gusto,
a todos y
cuídense
todas.
mucho. Gracias a la universidad por esta infraestructura. Excelente, gracias.
Siento que están saliendo de la casa, entonces voy a dejar que salgan todos primero.
Debe haber personas que se les queda ahí prendido igual.